Hello, my dear friends. I hope everyone is well. One of the people that had a very profound impact on me when I was a young man, I'm still young, but not as young as I used to be, obviously, was Rosh Shvadron. Rosh Shvadron was known as the Maggid of Yerushalayim. Magidim were an institution that were very common before World War II, during the 17th, 18th, 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. There were many, many famous Magidim, and they were itinerant preachers. They would travel from city to city. They were great storytellers. They were captivating, exciting, interesting, and they would hold the audience in the palm of their hands, tell a great story. You felt like you were mamish there, and then they would use that as a springboard to deliver a very powerful message. Rosh Hashanah was probably the most famous Maggid of the 20th century. I heard Rosh Hashanah the first time. He was born in Yerushalayim in 1912, and he passed away in 1997. He lived in Yerushalayim his entire life, but he traveled around the world delivering his drushos. I heard him in the first time when I was about 16 years old. I was learning in yeshiva in Philadelphia, and he came to Philadelphia and he spoke, and I was just overwhelmed, blown away by the power of his eloquence and delivery. And he was so engaging, and he told a story like you were mamish living the story with him, and he was able to move the audience in very powerful ways. In 1970, my father, Zichrono Livracha, who was the Rabbi of Israel Forest Hills, took a sabbatical leave, and our family spent 1 year living in Yerushalayim. We lived in Rechavia, and we davened in Shari Chesed, which is right off of Rechavia. And in Shari Chesed, there were many great Gedolim. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach lived in Rechavia, and Rosh Hashanah lived there as well. And we davened in the same shul where Rosh Hashanah davened. To hear Rosh Hashanah daven, in just the davening, was transported, at least me, and I'm sure it had the same impact on others, to Gan Eden. He had a deep, booming voice that resonated, and he davened with tremendous feeling, and the words were so captivating and beautiful, the way he would, in his sing-song way, and oftentimes he would daven for the Amud. That in itself was an experience. But even more so, I was impacted by the drushes that he gave. He would speak Friday night in one of the shuls in Yerushalayim. I think the neighborhood was Zichron Mordechai, maybe Zichron Meir, and his drushes were, I never heard even after that, I never heard a speaker as powerful and as engaging as Rav Shalom. He would tell terrific stories. Many of his stories, are Rabbi Pesach Kron has a fantastic series called the Maggid series. Maggid, he was very close to Rav Shalom, and he recorded many of his stories. If you haven't read any of the Magiddim books, you should do so, because all of the stories are very powerful. And Rabbi Kron is a powerful storyteller in and of his own right. So Rav Shvadron passed away Chof Beis Kislev. Chof Beis Kislev is his yahrzeit in 1997. 2 days ago, this past Tuesday, was Chof Beis Kislev, 3 days before Hanukkah. So it's appropriate for me to share with you something that was said by Rav Shvadron. Rav Shvadron's drushes were recorded in a sefer called Lev Shalom. I believe it was published posthumously, and he has a fantastic insight on this week's Parsha. And the Rav Shvadron was a Baal Musar. The Baal Musar were the disciples of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and his Talmidim. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter launched the Musar movement, and one of the main themes of Musar is that a person always has to be suspicious of their motives, because we're often biased and we often have ulterior motives. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, very interestingly, preceded Sigmund Freud in its discussion of subconscious drives that move a person. He lived somewhat earlier than Sigmund Freud. And so Rav Shadron was a Talmud, not of Yisrael Salanter, but of Talmidim of Rav Yisrael Salanter, and he would often talk about this theme about a person has to be suspicious of their own motivations, and he delivers this thought in such a powerful way, and it's enormously relevant. I've dealt with so many situations where, unfortunately, if the people had heard what Rosh Hashanah had to say, maybe the outcome would have been different in the end. There's a Rashi in the beginning of the 39th parak of Vayeishev, where Yosef is sold by his brothers into slavery, and he ends up in the house of Potiphar, who's one of the dignitaries in the court of Paro. Potiphar's wife, who the Chumash refers to as Eshes Potiphar, has designs on Yosef. She tries to seduce him. Yosef runs out of the house, and she was enraged. So when her husband came home, she told her husband that Yosef tried to make advances to her. The husband was furious, and he has Yosef placed in the Egyptian prison where he languished for 12 years until he was able to interpret the dreams of Paro. Right before that episode of Yosef, the Torah tells us the story of Tamar. Tamar was married to one of Yehuda's sons, and he passed away. And then she married his brother. He also passed away. And then Tamar wanted to have children from the household of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and she went and disguised herself as a woman of ill repute. She stood along the road, and she was able to seduce Yehuda, who impregnated her. And then Yehuda didn't know who she was, she asked Yehuda for payment, and she said, "You could give me collateral, so until you make the payment." And he gave her his staff and his cloak and his signet. And then when she became pregnant, Yehuda didn't know that he was the father. Yehuda instructed that she should be burned at the stake. Why she deserved to be burned is another, because she wasn't married at that time. That's a separate topic. And Tamar tells Yehuda that whoever owns this signet ring and the cloak and the staff, he is the father of my child. And Yehuda recognizes, and he said, "Tzakim mimeni, she is correct. I am the father," and Tamar is saved. In the end, Tamar has two children, Zerach and Peretz. Zerach was the great-great-great-grandfather of Boaz. Boaz was the great-grandfather of David. So from that line of birth, that Tamar and Yehuda had the child of Zerach, emerged Malchus, David HaMelech, and eventually there's going to be Mashiach will emerge from that lineage as well. So Chazal say the story of Tamar is sort of like stuck in there in the middle of the parsha, because first the Torah talks about that the brothers sold Yosef into slavery. Then it tells us the story of Yehuda and Tamar, and then it tells us that Yosef ended up in the house of Potiphar. Why was the narrative interrupted with the story of Tamar? So Rashi quotes Chazal because there was a parallel similarity between Tamar and the wife of Potiphar. They were both mechaving l'shem shemayim. They both intended for the sake of heaven. They both wanted to have children from the household of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and that's why these two stories are adjacent to each other. Asks Rav Shvadron if they were both mechaving l'shem shemayim, if they both intended for the sake of heaven, how is it that Tamar was Zocha, she merited having a child who was the forefather of David HaMelech and Mashiach. So she was rewarded in a magnificent way. And in contrast, the Potiphar, Chazal say that she saw in astrology, or an astrologist told her that emerging from her would be a child from Yaakov's family, but the astrologer didn't know if it would be her or her daughter. She thought it would be her, and that's why in the end it was not her, it was her daughter, because Yosef, when he emerged from prison, Paro gave him Asnas, who was the daughter of Potiphar, as a wife. So, but her intentions were also l'shem shamayim, because she knew that she would have a child either from her or from her daughter, and nonetheless, Chazal, when they talk about her, say that she was a rashas, she was an evil person. Arurim harishayim, they say about the wife of Potiphar. Asked Rav Shvadron, what's the difference? They were both machavim l'shem shamayim. They both had intentions for the sake of heaven. So Rav Shvadron says that when people do things l'shem shamayim, it's very dangerous, because you never know if the motivation is pure, then it is indeed going to be l'shem shamayim. But oftentimes people convince themselves that what they're doing is l'shem shamayim, but in the end, what they're really doing is they're just fulfilling their own needs and drives and desires. And one of the ways to tell whether a person is doing something l'shem shamayim is to judge other forms of behavior of the individual. And if a person's midos are corrupt, and a person is insensitive, a person's abusive, a person gets angry, a person is infuriated if you don't listen to what he or she has to say, then you know that the person is not truly l'shem shamayim, because l'shem shamayim means you want to do the will of God. If you're not consistent, that means that you're not, even when you think you're doing l'shem shamayim, the person is not. And the worst crimes are committed l'shem shamayim, because if a person's doing it, if a person knows he's committing murder because he's angry. So even a murderer has limitations. How many people he'll murder? He has his own set of moral standards. He'll murder 5 people, but not 10 people. But when you do it l'shem shamayim, so you could murder, you could 9/11, you could blow up buildings and murder thousands of people in one fell swoop, because you're doing it l'shem shamayim. For the sake of heaven, the worst crimes are committed l'shem shamayim, because then the sky's the limit. Then I don't have to be limited by anything, because I'm doing the will of God. When in fact, it's not the will of God, it's that people who are terrorists are murderers, and they're using the will of God as a subterfuge to fool themselves, to make that they believe that what they're doing is indeed justified. So look at the difference between the aftermath of what Tamar did and what the wife of Potiphar did. When Tamar became pregnant, and Yehuda didn't know that he was the father, so he instructed that she should be burnt. So she sent a message to Yehuda saying that he gave her as collateral his signet ring and a cloak, because she had asked for payment. So he gave her those items for collateral. She said, whoever owns these things, the staff, the ring, and the cloak, he's the father of the child. And Yehuda saw them, and he admitted, I'm the father of the child. So Chazal questioned, why did she say, whoever this belongs to, he's the father? Why didn't she just say to Yehuda, hey, what are you doing? This is absurd. You are the father of the child, and here's the proof. Why didn't she come straight out and say that? So Chazal say, because she didn't want to embarrass Yehuda. And she, even though it meant sacrificing her own life, and not only her own life, but she was pregnant with twins, and Chazal say that she knew through divine prophecy that one of her children was going to be the source of malchus, of royalty of the Jewish people. She was willing to sacrifice herself and her embryos, because not to embarrass Yehuda. And the Chazal say that we derive from here, a person is better to throw yourself into a fiery furnace rather than embarrass another person. She was willing to give up her life and the life of her children, not to embarrass Yehuda. Such a person, it is possible to say that their motives are l'shem shamayim, because you see what tremendous sensitivity she had, and she thought of Yehuda, of his embarrassment, and she pushed aside her own self-interest. She had no self-interest. Such a person could do something that's l'shem shamayim, even though ostensibly it may appear like a crime, and that's a whole subject of discussion. Why was it justified? She did it l'shem shamayim, but was it justified that she should deceive Yehuda and pretend to be a woman of ill repute? But I'm not going to go into that right now. But the point is that she was l'shem shemayim, even though it appeared ostensibly to be something that was immoral, but her motives indeed were l'shem shemayim. In contrast, the wife of Potiphar, what happens after Yosef refuses her advances and pushes her aside? She becomes infuriated. She goes nuts. She runs to her husband. She tells her husband that Yosef tried to rape me. She fabricated accusations against him, the exact opposite of what actually occurred. And as a result, Yosef languished in the Egyptian prisons for 12 years. So you see, she was a person who, when she didn't get her own way, she would stop at nothing to destroy the other person. And therefore, she thought she was l'shem shemayim, because she thought that she was doing this in order to have a child from the lineage of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But really, what motivated her was the insult that she had, that she wanted, and her desire to live with Yosef, because he was a very handsome young man. So she thought, in her mind, she convinced herself she's doing l'shem shemayim, but really she was doing it to satisfy her own needs and desires. And that's why Chazal say that she was a rishas, she was an evil person. You could tell from the outcome what the difference between Tamar and Yehuda. And the lesson here is so relevant and so powerful, because oftentimes there are times when it's necessary to take a stand that will hurt other people. Sometimes people are not fulfilling their responsibilities in a proper way. And it's even though they'll be hurt if you speak up and you try to affect a certain change in leadership or things of that sort, it has to be done. But it's acceptable if it's done l'shem shemayim. But if the person's midos and character are not in order, then a person has to think 1,000 times that maybe what's driving this is not l'shem shemayim. Maybe the person is jealous. Maybe the person doesn't like the other person. Maybe the person is bearing a grudge, and that's what's driving it. And in their own minds, they think, oh, it's l'shem shemayim. I'm doing a big mitzvah. I'm doing it for the sake of the community. I'm doing it for the sake of the shul, for the sake of the yeshiva, whatever the circumstances are. But in fact, it is being driven and motivated, just like Potiphar, the wife of Potiphar. She was driven by her own attraction to Yosef, nothing to do with l'shem shemayim. So that's often the case. And I have seen so many situations over the course of my lifetime, and I'm sure you could think of your own experience as well, where people have made battles against other individuals, and the sky is the limit, because it's l'shem shemayim. They're not doing it, at least this is what they think, and this is what they say, I'm not doing it for my own sake. I'm doing it l'shem shemayim. Something has to be done. This person has to be removed from their position. And they literally destroy the other person, and they destroy his life, and they destroy his reputation. I'm dealing now with a certain situation that's very parallel, where a person's reputation is being destroyed, and there are people that claim that it's being done l'shem shemayim. It's not something that's taking place in Highland Park. It's much to the west of us. I'm not going to divulge what it is, but it's far away. But it is so common, these types of situations, where people are convinced that what they're doing is l'shem shemayim, and therefore the sky's the limit, and they will destroy everybody who gets in their way because they're doing it l'shem shemayim. And that's a super powerful lesson that we should take away. It's just after Rosh Hashanah's Yortzeit, and he was a person he was an authentic Baal Musar who understood the importance of recognizing one's motivations, that they're not always as pure as we would like to think, and especially when a person is hurting another individual, it's fire, because if you destroy somebody when it's not really justified, when there's ulterior motives, then the person is a rotzeach, then the person's a murderer. He's destroying somebody else's life. And we have to be super careful not to engage in that type of behavior.